In the quiet town of Greenock, the Holloway family looked perfect. Respected school teacher Richard Holloway, his gentle wife Laura, and their bright daughter Emily. But behind closed doors, secrets festered. When Laura vanished one autumn night, Richard claimed she had left him, and the police, led by his powerful brother, Officer Michael Holloway, believed him. For years, the town pitied Richard, trusting his every word. Yet Emily never stopped questioning. A buried body, a trail of lies and leaked files would expose a shocking truth. A father's crime, a brother's cover-up, and a daughter's relentless fight for justice. ChatGPT said, the Holloway family lived on Elm Street in the quiet town of Greenock, where nothing much ever seemed to happen. The town had one school, one church, and one main street lined with a bakery, a post office, and a small grocery store. Life there moved slowly, and people trusted each other. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and neighbors borrowed sugar without asking. In such a peaceful town, the Holloways stood out not because they were different, but because they seemed almost too perfect. Richard Holloway, the father, was a schoolteacher who had taught nearly everyone's child at one point or another. He had a warm smile, a soft voice, and a reputation for being patient and kind. Parents trusted him, children admired him, and the community respected him. His wife, Laura, was the picture of quiet grace. She never raised her voice in public, never missed a Sunday at church, and was often seen pushing a cart through the market with her teenage daughter Emily at her side. People thought of her as shy but dependable, the sort of woman who held her family together with gentle strength. Emily was only 14 when life in the Holloway home began to unravel. To the townspeople, the Holloways still looked flawless, but within their walls tension grew. Emily would lie in bed at night listening to the muffled arguments between her parents, her heart racing with unease. She never told anyone about the sounds of breaking glass or the sharp edge in her father's voice that didn't match the calm tone he showed the world. What she saw in public was different from what she lived through in private, but she lacked the words to explain it. Then came the autumn evening when everything changed. Laura vanished. Richard told neighbors and the police that she had left him for another man. He said she packed a bag late at night, walked out the front door, and never came back. To the shock of some and the quiet acceptance of others, the police closed the matter quickly. They said no foul play was suspected, and they filed the case as a domestic issue. People shook their heads in sympathy for Richard, imagining the pain of being abandoned by his wife. They brought him casseroles, offered him prayers, and praised him for his strength in raising Emily alone. But Emily felt no sympathy. Deep down, she knew the story didn't make sense. Her mother loved her too much to leave without a word, and she remembered the fear in Laura's eyes the week before she disappeared. Still, at 14, she had no power to challenge her father or the police. She carried her questions silently, watching as her father rebuilt his life without hesitation. He went back to teaching, smiling at parents during school events, shaking hands with neighbors, and keeping his reputation polished. The town of Greenock saw Richard Holloway as a man wronged, but Emily saw something else entirely, a man who knew more than he would ever admit. As Emily grew older, the cracks in her father's story became harder to ignore. The world around her seemed to accept the version he had given, but in her heart the unanswered questions kept piling up. She would sit in her room at night, replaying the memories of that last week with her mother. The tension in the house had been unbearable, the arguments sharp and cruel, and then suddenly her mother was simply gone. No note, no goodbye. Nothing left behind except the lingering sense that something terrible had happened. Richard insisted she had left for another life, but Emily couldn't remember seeing her mother pack a single bag or take any of her favorite belongings. Laura's wedding ring, her photo albums, even her cherished books had all been left behind, untouched, as though she had never planned to leave at all. The town of Greenock was quick to side with Richard, and that loyalty made Emily feel isolated. Richard was still the beloved teacher, always polite, always helpful. People invited him to dinners, praised him for raising his daughter alone, and defended him whenever someone dared to ask uncomfortable questions. To most, Richard was a man holding his head high after being abandoned by a selfish wife. To Emily, he was a man hiding behind a mask. She began to notice the way he carefully avoided talking about Laura, how he brushed off any questions and changed the subject whenever her name was mentioned. His silence was louder than his words. Over the years, Emily found herself drawn to the people who had known her mother best. One of Laura's closest friends, Mrs. Delaney, confided in her that Laura had expressed fear in the days before she disappeared. She had spoken of arguments with Richard that had grown darker, more threatening. Laura had even told her friend she felt trapped, as if something was closing in on her. Hearing this confirmed what Emily had long suspected. Her mother hadn't simply walked away. She had been silenced. Other memories surfaced as Emily allowed herself to think more deeply about that night. She remembered the faint smell of smoke drifting into her room, the flickering light outside her window, and the way her father had been burning something in the backyard. At the time, she had been too young to make sense of it, too frightened to ask questions, but now it haunted her. What had he destroyed that night? Why had the police never asked about it? The years rolled on, but the unease never left her. She finished school, went to college, and tried to build a life of her own. Yet the shadow of that unanswered mystery clung to her. Every family photo, every memory of her mother's smile was stained by the thought that justice had been denied. The more she tried to accept the story, the more it unraveled in her mind. Richard's calm exterior, the community's blind trust, the police's quick dismissal. It all pointed toward something deeper, something hidden. By the time Emily was in her early 20s, she could no longer ignore it. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She had been taken from her. And the man she called father might have been the one responsible all along. 10 years had passed since Laura's disappearance, when fate finally cracked open the silence that had covered the Holloway family for so long. Greenock had remained the same quiet town, with its market stalls and winding streets. But Emily had grown into a woman who carried questions heavier than most could bear. Life had taught her how to smile for appearances, how to walk past her father in the kitchen without trembling. But inside, she still lived in the shadow of a mystery that refused to fade. That shadow grew darker the day construction workers began digging land just behind the Holloway property. It was meant to be routine work, the clearing of ground for a new row of houses. But what the workers uncovered that morning sent a chill through everyone involved. Beneath the soil, wrapped in torn sheets and buried in a shallow grave, were human remains. The discovery sent whispers racing through town like wildfire. For many, the unspoken thought was immediate. Could this be Laura? For Emily, it wasn't a question at all. Deep inside, she knew. Police arrived quickly, their cars blocking off the area, their voices hushed. The remains were gathered, documented, and taken away under heavy guard. The community expected a statement, some clear acknowledgement of what had been found. But when officials finally spoke, their words were strangely detached. They claimed the bones were too old to be connected to Laura's case, suggesting they might have belonged to someone from decades earlier. It was a neat explanation, one that allowed the town to move on without looking too closely at its beloved teacher. Emily, however, wasn't convinced. She requested access to public records about the discovery, and what she found unsettled her even more. The official reports contradicted what she had heard from the workers. The height, the build, the personal items unearthed near the body all matched her mother. Yet the documents released to the public insisted otherwise. Days later, whispers surfaced of leaked files. A journalist from a neighboring city claimed DNA samples had in fact been taken and had pointed directly to Laura. But those results had been buried before they could be confirmed. The contradictions sparked a storm inside Emily. She revisited her memories with sharper clarity, recalling the night of the fire in the backyard, the sudden disappearance, the silence that followed. Every piece of evidence seemed to point in one direction, but the authorities resisted at every turn. Her father's calm demeanor, his insistence that Laura had left, now seemed like a rehearsed performance. The town's trust in him became another barrier, making Emily feel like she was trapped in a play where everyone had been given a script except her. But the truth was clawing its way into the light. The body had been found too close to home, the sheets too familiar, the denials too rehearsed. The quiet acceptance that had protected Richard Holloway for a decade was beginning to unravel. For the first time, Emily felt the possibility that her suspicions might not remain secrets inside her heart. Evidence was out there, and even if the police wanted it buried, the ground itself had spoken. The discovery behind the Holloway property refused to fade into the background, no matter how hard the authorities tried to silence it. For years, the town had believed Richard's story, But the unearthed remains had planted a seed of doubt that grew quickly. Local journalists began asking uncomfortable questions, digging into old police files and reaching out to neighbors who had once been ignored. What they uncovered revealed not only the possibility of murder, but also a system that had worked hard to protect Richard from suspicion. It began with a leak. An anonymous envelope arrived at the office of the Greenock Gazette, the town's small newspaper. Inside were photocopies of police documents marked confidential. The papers revealed that witness statements taken in the days after Laura disappeared had never been filed properly. Neighbors had reported seeing smoke rising from the Holloway backyard that night. Others had described hearing shouting and a loud thud. None of those details had ever appeared in the official record. Even more alarming, there were notes showing that the DNA results from the unearthed remains had been a match to Laura. Yet the final public report had been rewritten to say otherwise. The scandal broke wide open when the Gazette published the findings. At first, the community resisted believing it. Richard had been their trusted teacher, a man they had known for years. But as more evidence came to light, the weight of denial became impossible to carry. The question shifted from whether Richard was guilty to how the police had allowed him to go free for so long. The answer lay in his brother, Michael Holloway. At the time of Laura's disappearance, Michael had been a senior officer in the Greenock Police Department. The leaked files showed his signature on key documents, including the reclassification of Laura's case as a domestic departure rather than a missing person report. He had authorized the destruction of items retrieved from the Holloway home, items that might have connected Richard directly to Laura's fate. For years, Michael had been a silent shield, ensuring his brother's reputation remained untarnished and his crime hidden beneath layers of paperwork and lies. Public anger grew with each revelation. Citizens who once praised Richard now whispered about the monster he might have been all along. Parents pulled their children from his classes, the school board suspended him, and the Holloway name became the subject of bitter gossip rather than admiration. More importantly, outside investigators were called in to review the case. Their arrival stripped away the last defenses of the Greenock police, exposing not only corruption but also a web of complicity that reached further than anyone had imagined. Emily watched all of this unfold with a mix of grief and grim satisfaction. For years she had carried the truth alone, doubting her own memories, but now the world was finally seeing what she had always known. The cracks in the story her father built were shattering into pieces, and with every revelation, justice felt closer than it ever had before. The arrest of Richard Holloway was a moment that changed Greenock forever. For over a decade, he had walked freely among the townspeople, his smile and calm demeanor convincing them of his innocence. Now the mask had slipped away, and the man they once trusted stood in handcuffs, his face pale and tight as cameras flashed and reporters shouted his name. The trial that followed became the most talked-about event the town had ever witnessed. Courtrooms that once handled only petty thefts and disputes over fences were suddenly the stage for a case that revealed a chilling story of betrayal, murder, and corruption. The prosecution built its case carefully, laying out every detail that had been hidden. Forensic experts confirmed that the remains found behind the Holloway property were Laura's, the DNA results undeniable. The torn sheets wrapped around her body matched the Holloway household linen. Fire specialists testified that burn patterns in the backyard soil aligned with the timeline of Laura's disappearance, consistent with items being destroyed. Witnesses who had been ignored a decade earlier finally had their voices heard, recounting the smoke, the arguments, and the sudden silence that followed. Piece by piece, the story of what had happened that night took shape, and it was damning. Richard's defense tried to hold on to the image of the respectable teacher, claiming the evidence was circumstantial, but it was no longer enough. The lies had piled too high, and the documents leaked from the police department left little room for doubt. When Michael Holloway's involvement was revealed, the courtroom gasped. Records showed he had altered reports, hidden witness statements, and deliberately misled investigators to protect his brother. His fall was swift and brutal. Once a trusted officer, he was now branded as corrupt, his badge a symbol of betrayal rather than honor. Emily sat in the courtroom each day, her presence a reminder of the real cost of Richard's actions. She listened to the testimony with clenched fists, forcing herself to confront details she had long feared to face. The image of her father as a loving parent was shattered, replaced by the truth of a man who had silenced her mother and buried her beneath the soil they walked on. Yet as painful as it was, she also felt a sense of vindication. For years she had been made to question her own memories, her own instincts, and now the world finally saw what she had always known. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Richard Holloway was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His brother Michael faced charges of obstruction of justice and evidence tampering, ensuring that both men would spend their lives behind bars. The town of Greenock, once blinded by trust, was forced to reckon with how easily they had been deceived. For Emily, justice did not erase the pain, but it gave her something she had lived without for too long: closure. She could finally speak her mother's name without the weight of unanswered questions. The truth had risen from the ground and the cover-up had failed. Greenock would never forget the story of Richard Holloway, but for Emily it was no longer a shadow over her life. It was the end of silence and the beginning of peace.